I was never just an employee. I was the one holding the entire system together, while they pretended I didn't exist. Then they handed my project to someone they liked more than they trusted. That was the moment I stopped saving them. And within weeks, everything I built began to quietly collapse. The moment I stopped saving them didn't feel dramatic. No alarms, no speeches, no cinematic silence where everyone suddenly realizes what they lost. It felt quiet, like turning off a machine that had been running on my lungs for years. I sat in my apartment in Chicago that morning, watching the city move through my window. Delivery trucks, office workers, steam rising from street vents. The company didn't know it yet, but their entire system was already starting to drift off balance. Because I was the balance. My name is Emily Carter, 32 years old, operations manager at Northbridge Logistics, one of the fastest-growing supply chain firms in the Midwest, at least on paper. In reality, I was the infrastructure. I built routing systems, vendor networks, compliance frameworks, and emergency logistics protocols from nothing. Not upgraded, built. From scratch. Nights, weekends, holidays. While others went home, I stayed with spreadsheets and failing APIs. And still, no one really saw me, not even the people who depended on me most. The first person to walk into my office that morning was Daniel Mercer. Daniel was our senior finance director. Mid-40s, tall, slightly hunched like he was permanently leaning away from responsibility. He wore perfectly tailored navy suits, always one shade too expensive for someone who claimed he was just managing budgets. His face was sharp, almost elegant, but always tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Years ago, he had survived a corporate restructuring that wiped out half his old firm. People said that event made him cautious, but I knew the truth. It made him obedient. He didn't challenge decisions anymore. He survived them. "Emily," he said, standing at my doorway instead of stepping in. That was his habit, never fully entering a space where he might be accountable. "We're seeing some irregularities in the East Coast shipment flow." I didn't look up from my screen. There are no irregularities. There's a delay in vendor confirmation because procurement ignored the updated routing protocol I sent last month. Daniel hesitated. That was another thing about him. He knew when I was right, but he needed permission to agree. "I'll escalate it," he said finally. "You can," I replied. "Or you can forward the email you ignored and pretend it's new information." He left without answering. That was Daniel. A man trained not to fix problems, just to repackage them. At 10:17 a.m., Jason Miller walked into the building. Jason was the new addition. 22 years old, fresh MBA, clean haircut, expensive sneakers that screamed confidence bought on credit. He had a symmetrical face, almost engineered, the kind of person executives liked because he looked like he belonged in photos more than meetings. He was assigned to learn operations. From me. "Hey, Emily," he said too loudly, like enthusiasm was a replacement for experience. "Richard said you'd get me up to speed on everything." Everything. That word almost made me laugh. Jason had no idea that everything meant 8 years of undocumented systems, personal vendor relationships, and exceptions built on exceptions. I nodded. "Start with the North Route dependency map. It's in the shared drive." He blinked. "Which folder?" "That's your first lesson," I said. "If you need a folder, you're already behind." He laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. By noon, I received the email that changed everything. Subject line: Project Atlas. Leadership Assignment Update. I opened it slowly. Jason Miller had been appointed interim lead of the project I designed, structured, and stabilized over 3 years. No mention of my name. No acknowledgement of authorship. Just a clean, sterile transfer of ownership like I was a line item that could be reassigned. I stared at it for a long time. Not angry, not surprised, just confirmed. So this was the decision. I closed my laptop, and for the first time in 8 years, I did not fix anything. Jason Miller became the company's new favorite problem before he even learned where the bathrooms were. I first noticed it in the way people shifted when he entered a room. Not respect, something closer to performance. Smiles sharpened, voices softened. Even the air in the office seemed to adjust itself around him. Jason was 22, freshly graduated from an MBA program that cost more than my first 3 years of salary combined. He was tall, lean, with carefully styled brown hair that never looked like it had met stress. His face carried that permanent expression of someone who expected doors to open before he reached them. And most of the time, they did. He wore confidence like it was inherited, not earned. That morning, I was called into Richard Blake's office. Richard was the CEO of Northbridge Logistics, a man in his late 50s with a heavy build and silver hair always combed back too precisely, like control was something he could apply with a brush. He had a calm voice that made even bad decisions sound reasonable. People feared his approval more than his anger. Standing beside him was Jason. "Emily," Richard said, leaning back in his leather chair, "this is Jason Miller. He'll be joining us as an operations intern." Intern? The word felt wrong the moment it left his mouth. Jason wasn't introduced like someone starting at the bottom. He was introduced like someone already halfway up. Jason extended his hand. His grip was firm, rehearsed. "Really excited to learn from you," he said. "Learn from me?" I studied him for a second. "We'll see how fast you learn." His smile flickered just slightly, like he didn't expect resistance. Richard cleared his throat. "Jason will be shadowing you directly. Full exposure to operations. I want him in your meetings, your reports, everything." Everything again. I understood what that meant immediately. Not training, not development. Surveillance wrapped in mentorship. "You want me to manage my workload and babysit at the same time?" I said. "Don't frame it like that," Richard replied smoothly. "Think of it as leadership development." Jason nodded quickly, as if agreeing was part of the evaluation. I didn't argue. I rarely did when I already knew the outcome was decided elsewhere. By noon, Jason was seated at the edge of my glass-walled office. He typed loudly, unnecessarily, like productivity needed sound to exist. I gave him access to the North Route dependency map, the system I had built over years of failed vendor negotiations and emergency reroutes. He stared at it like it was a foreign language. "What's all of this?" he asked. "That," I said without looking up, "is why trucks don't disappear between states." He laughed, thinking I was exaggerating. I wasn't. Later that afternoon, I was pulled into a strategic alignment meeting. Jason was already there. Inside the conference room sat 3 other executives: Karen Holt, head of HR, a sharp woman in her late 40s with perfectly symmetrical bob-cut hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes; Marcus Doyle, head of client relations, a heavy-set man with a constant red face like he was always one sentence away from shouting; and Lena Brooks, a junior analyst in her mid-20s, nervous posture, always clutching a tablet like it could protect her from being spoken to. Jason sat at the head of the table, not because he earned it, because someone decided he should practice. Richard wasn't even in the room, but his influence was. "We're rebranding Project Atlas," Karen said, sliding a document forward. "Jason will be leading the initiative moving forward." Marcus nodded. "Fresh perspective is what we need." I almost laughed at that. Fresh perspective on a system I designed, stabilized, and rescued 3 times during peak season failures. Jason cleared his throat. "I think we can streamline a lot of outdated processes." Outdated. That word again. He glanced at me as he said it, waiting for approval. I gave him none. After the meeting, Lena followed me into the hallway. She was small, pale, with tired eyes that suggested she had already worked 3 jobs in her life and was currently working a 4th just by existing here. "Emily," she whispered, "they're really giving him Atlas?" "They already did," I said. She hesitated. "But you built it." I stopped walking. For a moment, I studied her. She reminded me of myself before I learned not to expect fairness. "Yes," I said. "I did." Then I kept walking, because at that point, explaining the truth no longer changed anything. Only timing did. The first time I heard the name Atlas, I almost didn't react. It came during a company-wide email sent at 6:03 a.m., the kind of hour chosen specifically so people absorb decisions before they have the strength to question them. Project Atlas, a new era in operations. No mention of me. No mention of the architecture I designed, the routing logic, the vendor redundancy systems I built during 2 years of overnight failures. Just a clean, polished announcement, like the foundation had built itself. I stood in my apartment kitchen in Chicago, holding a coffee I didn't drink, staring at the screen until the letters stopped feeling like language. Atlas. A name designed to sound powerful, mythological, heavy. Fitting, I thought bitterly, for something they had decided to carry without acknowledging who built the weight. At the office that morning, Jason Miller arrived earlier than usual. He looked more confident than before, like confidence itself had become part of his daily routine. Jason was tall, athletic in a casual way, wearing a crisp white shirt with sleeves rolled just slightly too perfectly. His hair was styled with precision that suggested either effort or money, or both. He greeted everyone on his way in. People responded like he was already senior staff. "Did you see the announcement?" he asked me, sliding into my office without waiting for permission. "I saw it," I replied. He smiled. "Pretty exciting, right? Being part of something this big?" Being part. He still didn't understand he wasn't part of it. He was being placed on top of it. I studied him for a moment. "Do you know what Atlas actually is?" "It's the new logistics platform," he said carefully. "It's the old system with emergency layers, predictive rerouting, and vendor fail-safes," I corrected. "It's everything that stops shipments from collapsing when reality doesn't follow the plan." He nodded slowly, not fully understanding but pretending he did. That was Jason's talent. Not comprehension, adaptation. The real shift came later that afternoon when Richard Blake called a leadership briefing. Richard was already waiting in the glass conference room when I arrived. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, sleeves rolled with deliberate informality. His silver hair was immaculate, his expression calm in the way only people insulated from consequences can be. Beside him sat Jason, and across from them, Victor Lang, newly appointed external operations advisor. Victor was in his late 50s, thin, with a sharp angular face and cold blue eyes that scanned rooms like he was auditing them. He wore wireframe glasses and spoke like every sentence was already pre-approved by a board. And Sarah Kim, a mid-level strategist with long black hair tied in a strict ponytail, sharp posture, and nervous hands that betrayed her ambition. She avoided eye contact with me entirely. Richard began. "As you know, Atlas will redefine our operational identity. Jason will be leading execution." Leading execution. Not designing, not building, leading. Victor nodded approvingly. "Fresh leadership is essential for scalability." I almost smiled at that. Scalability. A word people use when they don't understand complexity. Sarah opened her tablet. "We've identified some legacy inefficiencies in the routing system. We'll be phasing out certain components." Legacy inefficiencies. That meant me. Jason glanced at me briefly, then quickly away, like he knew something didn't belong but didn't want to name it. I said nothing. Because at that moment, I realized something important. They weren't just replacing me. They were erasing me in real time. After the meeting, I didn't go back to my desk immediately. Instead, I walked to the far end of the office floor where the maintenance storage room sat. Unlocked, ignored, forgotten. Inside, I found a small desk, dim light, and silence. That was enough. I opened my laptop and began doing something I had never done before during work hours. I started documenting everything. System diagrams, vendor contracts, emergency overrides, internal escalation chains. Every dependency, every hidden logic loop, every workaround I had created to keep the company from collapsing during its worst moments. Not because I was emotional, because I was precise. If they wanted Atlas without me, then they were going to learn what Atlas actually was, and what it cost to remove the person holding it together. The boardroom was too bright for what was about to happen. White lighting, polished glass, a long mahogany table reflecting every movement like it was recording more than just images. It was recording consequences. I arrived exactly on time. I always did. Punctuality was one of the few things in this company that still belonged to me. Inside, the room was already full. Richard Blake sat at the head of the table, CEO of Northbridge Logistics. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a calm, controlled posture that made him look like nothing could ever surprise him. Mostly because he made sure nothing ever had the chance to. Beside him was Jason Miller, 22, clean-cut, freshly pressed shirt, posture too upright to be natural. His confidence had evolved quickly over the past weeks, shaped not by experience but by constant validation. He now smiled less nervously and more expectantly, like he was waiting for applause after every sentence. Across from them sat Victor Lang, the external advisor. Late 50s, thin, sharp jawline, expression permanently skeptical. His glasses caught the light every time he turned his head, making him look like he was constantly recalculating people in real time. And scattered around the table were my colleagues. Marcus Doyle, head of client relations, heavy-set, sweating slightly despite the cold room, his tie slightly loose like he had already given up on being comfortable in his own job. Karen Holt, HR director, mid-40s, precise bob haircut, arms crossed tightly, expression neutral but her eyes alert, always calculating risk over truth. Lena Brooks, junior analyst, early 20s, pale, fragile posture, hands gripping her tablet like it was the only thing anchoring her to the room. And then there was me, Emily Carter. I stood out without trying, not because I wanted to, but because I had built everything this room depended on. Richard smiled when I sat down. That kind of smile that looks friendly from a distance but feels like distance up close. "Let's begin," he said. Jason straightened slightly. "This meeting," Richard continued, "is about formally aligning leadership for Project Atlas moving forward." My stomach didn't drop. It didn't need to. I already knew. Still, hearing it aloud made it real in a way silence never could. Victor nodded. "Execution requires unified direction. Fragmented ownership is inefficient." Fragmented ownership. Another way of saying, you don't belong in this version of the story. Jason cleared his throat. "I'm really honored to be leading Atlas. I've been studying the system closely and I think we can scale it significantly." Studying. I almost laughed. He had been inside the system for weeks. That wasn't study, that was tourism. Karen slid a document forward. "We're formalizing role assignments today." She didn't look at me when she said it. No one did. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. He avoided eye contact, pretending to read something on his laptop that wasn't there. Lena looked at me once. Just once. Her expression was small, apologetic, helpless. Then she looked away. That was the moment I understood something more important than betrayal. Fear always wins in rooms like this. Richard finally spoke again. "Emily, your contributions have been invaluable. However, we believe this phase requires centralized leadership. Centralized leadership. A polite way of saying removal." Jason glanced at me briefly, then quickly looked back at Richard, like he didn't want to witness what he was benefiting from. Karen continued. "Effective immediately, Jason Miller will assume full project leadership. Emily will transition into a supporting advisory capacity." Supporting. Advisory. Invisible roles disguised as participation. I nodded slowly. Not because I agreed, because I was observing. The room exhaled. That collective relief people feel when injustice is finalized and they are no longer required to respond to it. Jason smiled wider now. "I really appreciate the trust. I won't let anyone down." He looked at me again, this time longer, waiting for approval. I gave him none. Instead, I looked around the table. Marcus avoiding me. Karen already mentally moved on. Victor already evaluating risk containment. Richard already thinking about the next announcement. Not one of them saw what they had just done. They thought they were replacing a person. They didn't realize they were disconnecting the system from its power source. After the meeting, I walked out without speaking. No confrontation, no emotional exit, no dramatic pause, just silence. In the hallway, Lena followed me for a few steps but stopped halfway, like she was afraid even walking beside me might be noticed. I didn't look back. Because I finally understood the truth. I wasn't being pushed out, I was being rewritten out of existence. And the next version of the company wouldn't survive what it didn't understand. I didn't quit loudly. I didn't argue in meetings, didn't send emotional emails, didn't try to reclaim a seat that had already been quietly reassigned. Instead, I started disappearing in a way no one noticed at first. Emily Carter, 32, tall, lean, always dressed in neutral tones that made her blend into corporate glass and steel environments, had spent years becoming invisible in plain sight. Her dark hair was tied back most days, not for style but for efficiency. Her face carried the calm of someone who had survived too many urgent crises to still believe urgency meant importance. What they mistook for compliance was actually calculation. And now, I was calculating my exit. The first person to notice something off was Lena Brooks. Lena was a junior analyst, mid-20s, soft-spoken with tired eyes and a habit of pressing her pen against her lips when thinking. She wasn't built for corporate aggression, which meant she saw things others ignored. She found me in the storage side office again, the one no one officially used. "Emily," she said quietly, stepping inside like she was entering a restricted space. "You've been moving a lot of files." I didn't look up from my laptop. "I've been organizing documentation." "That's not your job anymore," she said carefully. I finally looked at her. "You think any of this was ever just a job description?" She didn't answer, because she knew the truth. Job descriptions were fiction. Systems were real. While the company moved forward with Jason Miller as its public face, I moved backward through its architecture. I reviewed every major contract tied to Project Atlas. Not emotionally, not angrily, legally, structurally, quietly. There were 3 layers most people never saw. The visible system, what executives talked about. The operational system, what managers used. And the foundational system, what I built when everything else broke. That last layer was mine, and I was checking what still belonged to me. One afternoon I met Harrison Cole, the company's legal counsel. Harrison was in his late 30s, slightly disheveled, with permanent dark circles under his eyes like he had made peace with sleeplessness years ago. He spoke softly, always choosing words like he was afraid they might become evidence later. He adjusted his glasses nervously when I placed a stack of printed contracts on his desk. "Emily, this is a lot," he said. "It's everything tied to Atlas infrastructure ownership," I replied. He flipped through the pages. "These clauses, they weren't flagged during transfer." "They weren't supposed to be," I said. That made him pause. Harrison wasn't incompetent, he was just trained to process, not question. Until now. At the same time, Jason was being prepared for visibility. He had meetings scheduled with external partners, though he didn't understand half the terminology being used around him. I watched from a distance as he practiced presentations with Sarah Kim, the strategist. Sarah, mid-30s, sharp-featured with tightly tied hair and a constant urgency in her voice, tried to coach him through system diagrams I had designed. "That node represents vendor dependency," she explained. Jason nodded. "Right, so we just optimize it?" Sarah hesitated. "Yes, but it's more complex than—" Jason cut her off. "Got it. Optimization." He didn't. But no one corrected him, because correction implied ownership of the confusion, and no one wanted that responsibility. That evening, I received an email. Subject: Confidential Opportunity, External Advisory Role. It was from a startup outside Illinois, North Peak Systems, a logistics optimization company expanding into multi-state automation. They had heard about me, not through the company, through results. The email was simple. "We believe you are the architecture behind systems we've been trying to replicate for years." No corporate language, no filters, just recognition. I stared at it for a long time. Recognition always arrives too late from the places that matter and too early from the places that don't know you yet. But this time, I replied. It didn't happen all at once. That was the first thing they misunderstood. Companies don't collapse like buildings in movies. No dramatic explosions, no sudden implosion. They fail the way people get sick. Quietly, then suddenly, then irreversibly. I was already gone from the main office by then, working remotely from a small co-working space in downtown Chicago. The room smelled like recycled air and cheap coffee. My new routine was simple. Observe, document, detach. Emily Carter, 32, tall, slender, dark hair usually tied in a low, practical knot, face calm in a way that now looked less like patience and more like distance, sat at a shared desk near a window, watching notifications stack up like unpaid debts. And Northbridge Logistics was starting to bleed. The first sign came from Marcus Doyle. Marcus, head of client relations, a heavy-set man in his early 40s with a permanent flushed complexion and a habit of wiping his forehead even in air-conditioned rooms, called Jason directly instead of using internal escalation channels. His voice came through a forwarded recording I later received from Lena. "This is unacceptable," Marcus snapped. "3 major shipments are stuck in limbo. Clients are threatening penalties." Jason responded awkwardly. "I think we just need to recalibrate the routing logic?" Recalibrate. A word used by people who had never built the thing they were recalibrating. Marcus paused. "Do you know how it works?" Silence. That silence said everything. The second crack appeared in the system itself. A routing failure in the Midwest distribution layer triggered cascading delays across 3 states. Normally, the system would self-correct within minutes. I built it that way after a supplier collapse in year 2 nearly cost us a Fortune 500 contract. But now the correction loop didn't activate, because the override protocol sat inside a sublayer only I maintained, and I was no longer there to maintain it. Inside the office, Sarah Kim tried to stabilize the situation. Sarah, mid-30s, sharp-featured with tightly pulled-back black hair and a constant urgency in her voice, stood in front of Jason during an emergency briefing. "We need to roll back the Atlas update branch," she said firmly. Jason frowned. "Won't that disrupt optimization gains?" "There are no gains if the system is down," she replied. That was the closest she came to frustration. Jason hesitated. "Let's get another opinion." But there was no other opinion anymore. Not one that understood the architecture deeply enough to intervene. Meanwhile, clients began noticing. One of them was Hector Graves, CEO of Graves Supply Chain Solutions. Hector was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a shaved head and a voice that sounded like he had never asked a question without expecting an answer immediately. He called Richard Blake directly. I only learned about the call later through an internal memo leaked by Lena. "We are experiencing unacceptable instability," Hector said. "Your system failed 3 critical delivery windows this week." Richard attempted to deflect. "We're undergoing leadership transition." Hector cut him off. "I don't care about your leadership. I care about my shipments." That sentence changed everything. Because logistics companies don't survive leadership stories. They survive reliability. By the end of the week, contracts began to shift. Not dramatically, not publicly. Quiet exits, non-renewals. Delayed renewals suddenly becoming under review. The kind of changes that don't look like collapse until you zoom out. And when you zoomed out far enough, Northbridge was starting to look unstable. Jason tried to fix it the only way he knew how: visibility. He scheduled a Stability Alignment Summit. The name alone was ironic enough to make me pause when I saw the invite forwarded by Lena. Inside the summit, Jason presented charts he didn't fully understand. Sarah tried to quietly correct inconsistencies. Marcus looked increasingly exhausted, and Richard remained silent, watching the room like he was trying to decide whether to intervene or disappear. No one mentioned me, not once. But everything they were discussing still had my fingerprints on it. Every failure, every delay, every missing correction loop. That night, I received another message from North Peak Systems. "We are observing market instability in systems you previously architected. Our interest has increased significantly." I stared at it longer than I expected, because now it wasn't just recognition, it was validation. From the outside world. The inside was still too busy collapsing to notice what it had lost. And I finally understood something simple. They didn't remove me from the system. They removed the system's ability to hold itself together. They called me at 7:13 a.m. I knew it was Richard before I even looked at the screen. Richard Blake, CEO of Northbridge Logistics, once composed, always controlled, now reduced to urgency disguised as politeness. A man in his late 50s with silver hair that used to symbolize authority, but now felt more like decay under pressure. He had spent his entire career believing control was permanent, until it wasn't. I answered on the 3rd ring. "Emily," his voice came through, tighter than I had ever heard it. We need to talk. I didn't respond immediately. I was sitting in the same co-working space, morning light reflecting off glass partitions, the hum of other people's lives continuing as if nothing important was happening. Talk, I said finally. A pause. That pause told me everything. He hated needing me. We're experiencing operational instability, he continued carefully, choosing words like someone walking through broken glass. The board is concerned. Clients are reacting. Reacting. A polite word for leaving. I glanced at my screen. 3 unread messages from Lena already this morning. She was the only one still inside who didn't filter reality through corporate language. I need you back, Richard said. No preamble, no negotiation, just exposure. That was the moment I knew the collapse had reached its final stage. The second voice came later that day. Karen Holt, HR director, mid-40s, always perfectly composed, hair sharp and symmetrical like it had been engineered for authority. Her voice, however, now carried something unfamiliar, hesitation. Emily, she said through a separate call, we're willing to reinstate your role fully, executive authority, compensation adjustment, whatever is required. Whatever is required. That phrase meant they had already lost control. I met Richard in person that afternoon. He looked different, still in a tailored suit but slightly off, tie loosened, posture less precise, eyes heavier. Power doesn't disappear all at once, it erodes in visible layers. Inside the glass conference room, he wasn't alone. Victor Lang sat beside him, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Victor was in his late 50s, thin, sharp jawline, glasses reflecting constant analysis. He looked less like an advisor now, and more like someone preparing a post-mortem. And there was Daniel Mercer, finance director, mid-40s, tall but slouched, suit slightly wrinkled like sleep had become optional. His face carried exhaustion mixed with fear, the kind of fear that comes when numbers stop behaving. Richard didn't waste time. We miscalculated, he admitted. The system dependencies are more fragile than anticipated. Jason is in over his head. In over his head, I repeated. No one corrected me, because no one could deny it anymore. Victor leaned forward. We need stabilization, immediate. Clients are requesting continuity assurances. Daniel added quietly. Revenue projections have dropped by 28% in 2 weeks. 28%. I almost smiled. That number was conservative. Richard exhaled slowly. We're asking you to return. There it was. Not a demand, not an order. A request. The first honest word I had heard from them in months. I sat back in my chair studying them. All 3 men. All once convinced they were in control of something they never fully understood. Then I said it. No. Silence hit the room instantly. Even Victor stopped moving. Richard blinked. No? I'm not returning as an employee. That changed the air completely. Karen tightened her grip on her pen. Daniel looked down at the table like it might explain something he missed. I continued calmly. I'll consult. Independent structure. External access only where required. Richard frowned. Consulting? Yes. And your terms? I slid a document onto the table. Not emotional, not aggressive, precise. Triple my previous compensation. Full system authority. Vendor communication control. Architecture governance rights. No internal override without written approval. Victor read it first. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tapped once on the table, a subtle sign of discomfort. This is extensive, he said. It matches the system you've been running without understanding it, I replied. Daniel swallowed. We don't have another option. That was the truth they didn't want to say out loud. Richard looked at me for a long moment. For the first time, I saw something close to resignation in his face. Finally, he nodded. Fine. Not agreement, surrender. As I left the building, Lena was waiting near the entrance. She looked exhausted, more than before. Eyes slightly red, posture tense like she hadn't slept properly in days. They're falling apart without you, she said quietly. I know, I replied. She hesitated. Are you going to fix it? I stopped walking. No, I said. Then I continued forward. Because fixing it was never the point anymore. Control was. And now they had remembered who actually held it. Austin felt nothing like Chicago. It was warmer, looser, less obsessed with glass walls and silent competition. The air carried a kind of openness I hadn't realized I was missing until I could breathe without calculating who was watching. I built my company there. Not loudly, not with press releases or staged announcements, just structure, contracts, and the quiet accumulation of trust from people who remembered results more than titles. My name was still Emily Carter, 32, tall, composed, dark hair now often left down instead of tied tightly, as if I no longer needed to prepare myself for impact every morning. The tension in my shoulders had softened, though my focus hadn't. If anything, it had sharpened. The office was small at first, just me, a second-hand desk, and Ryan Holt, my first hire. Ryan was 29, thin, slightly unshaven, with a restless energy that made him look like he was always half a thought ahead of reality. He used to work in systems integration at a mid-sized firm before leaving after a restructuring left him managing projects he didn't believe in. He wasn't like the people I used to work with. He asked questions before assuming answers. That alone made him invaluable. "We just got another inbound request," he said one morning, sliding a laptop toward me. "It's from Graves Supply Chain." I didn't look surprised. "They want direct engagement," he added. "Of course they do," I said. Because they remembered. Clients don't forget who keeps their systems alive at 2 a.m. when everything else fails. They forget titles first, not people. Meanwhile, back at Northbridge, things continued to unravel quietly. I received updates indirectly through Lena. Lena Brooks, once a junior analyst, now exhausted beyond her years, had become an accidental historian of collapse. Her messages were shorter now, less emotional, more factual. "Jason left last week. No announcement, just an empty desk." That was all she wrote. Jason Miller didn't exit like a villain or a failure. He just disappeared. No farewell email, no final meeting, no attempt to explain, because there was nothing left for him to explain. He had been placed in a role that required understanding he never possessed. And eventually, reality does what leadership cannot. It corrects itself. The real moment came 3 months later. Richard called me, not through assistance, direct. His voice was different this time. No urgency, no negotiation tone, just something closer to acknowledgement. "We've stabilized," he said. I didn't respond. He continued, slower now. "It wasn't Jason. It wasn't the board decisions. It was the architecture." Then the sentence he had avoided for months. "It was you." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the Austin skyline through wide windows. "Yes," I said simply. No denial anymore. No corporate cushioning. Just truth. Richard exhaled heavily. "We underestimated what you built." That was the closest he would ever come to an apology. Not for how they treated me, but for what they failed to understand. "I know," I replied. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable anymore, just final. A week later, I received a formal note from the board. Acknowledgement of intellectual ownership contributions. Past contributions. That phrase mattered. It meant they finally understood something fundamental. I was no longer part of their system. I was the reason it ever worked. At my office in Austin, we signed 3 new enterprise clients that month. Graves Supply Chain was one, then Hexler Group, then 2 more I had never worked with before, but who had spoken to people I had fixed problems for years ago. Trust moves slower than failure, but it travels farther. Ryan printed the contracts and placed them on my desk. "You realize," he said, half smiling, "this is basically becoming the system they tried to build." I looked at the stack of papers. "No," I said. "This one works without pretending it doesn't depend on anyone." That evening, I received one final message from Lena. "Richard said in a board meeting that you were the only reason the company survived its own expansion phase." Then another line. He looked tired when he said it. I closed the message and didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because there was nothing left to prove. I never went back. Not to Northbridge. Not to the rooms that once decided my relevance. They kept running. I built something else. And in the end, that was the only kind of victory that mattered. Not being invited back, but no longer needing to be. This story isn't just about Emily. It's about what you would do in her place. Would you stay in a system that uses your work but ignores your name? Or would you walk away and build something of your own? If you were Richard, would you admit the truth sooner? Or only after everything starts collapsing? If you were Jason, would you step aside when you realized you weren't ready? Or keep going because the title was already yours? And the real question, is leaving a failure? Or the only way to truly win? So tell me in the comments, stay and fight for recognition? Or leave and build your own future? And did Emily really win? Or just escape differently? If this story hit you, leave a like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this, because the next one might feel even closer to your reality.